A brave fight for freedom. Highlights from the meeting between U.S. and Ukrainian leaders. He's a brave man, putting up one hell of a fight. With these words, former U.S. President Donald Trump opened a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The phrase immediately set the tone. Respect for Ukraine's resilience in the face of Russia's invasion and recognition of the personal courage embodied by its leader. Context of the meeting. The gathering was one of dozens scheduled that day, but both leaders emphasized its importance. Zelensky began by thanking the U.S. not only for military and political support, but also for personal involvement in humanitarian issues, such as discussions between the first ladies of both countries about the fate of Ukrainian children. From there, attention quickly turned to the battlefield. Zelensky reported that Ukrainian forces had advanced 360 kilometers in the past month, capturing significant ground and thousands of Russian soldiers. He attributed this progress to the bravery of Ukrainian troops and the critical assistance provided by Western allies, particularly NATO countries and U.S. military aid. Key points of discussion. Military progress. Ukraine's recent territorial gains have boosted morale, but Zelensky stressed the need for continued support, especially in weapons supplies. Prisoner exchanges. With thousands of Russian soldiers captured, Kyiv is eager to negotiate exchanges to bring back Ukrainian fighters. Economic warfare. Both presidents highlighted the declining state of Russia's economy, arguing that sanctions and sustained pressure are essential to forcing Moscow to reconsider its aggression. Energy dependence. Zelensky specifically called on European states to reduce reliance on Russian oil and gas. While Slovakia showed openness to alternatives, Hungary's resistance remains a challenge. Diverging perspectives. When asked whether NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft violating Allied airspace, Zelensky's answer was clear. Yes, I do. Trump, however, was more cautious when pressed about long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, saying such discussions were a little bit too early. He also hinted at personal diplomacy, suggesting that a direct conversation with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán might persuade him to stop purchasing Russian energy. Progress. Since the last meeting for Trump, the most significant development since his previous meeting with Zelensky was Russia's economic collapse. What many predicted would be a swift war lasting 3 or 4 days has turned into a prolonged struggle, with Ukraine holding its ground against overwhelming odds. You've got to hand it to the Ukrainian soldiers, Trump remarked, underscoring the unexpected resilience of Ukraine's defense. Balanced reflections. On one side, there is admiration for Ukraine's military successes and the solidarity shown by Western allies. On the other, lingering questions remain. How far will NATO and the U.S. go in providing guarantees? Can Europe truly wean itself off Russian energy? And how sustainable is Ukraine's fight if the war drags on for years? A question for readers. The meeting reflected both hope and uncertainty. Ukraine's courage is undeniable, but the path to peace remains unclear. What do you think? Should Western allies escalate their support to speed up an end to the war? Or would that risk widening the conflict even further? Aligned with the world. Trump and Zelensky on Russia, NATO, and the path to peace. This war was supposed to be over in a matter of days. Instead, it has dragged on for 3.5 years, and it doesn't look like it will end anytime soon. With this remark, Donald Trump underscored the unexpected endurance of Ukraine's resistance and the prolonged strain on Russia's reputation. What was intended to be a quick, decisive campaign has turned into a drawn-out struggle that Moscow cannot easily claim as a victory. Drone incident in Denmark raises alarm. During the discussion, journalists asked Trump about reports of a possible Russian drone incursion in Denmark that temporarily shut down an airport near Copenhagen. He admitted awareness of the event but refrained from drawing conclusions. I have no response until I find out exactly what happened. We're going to know very soon. His cautious tone reflected the uncertainty surrounding the incident, which Denmark suggested might be sabotage. NATO's role and U.S. support pressed on whether the United States would back NATO allies if Russian aircraft were to be engaged in European airspace. Trump answered carefully, "Depends on the circumstance." Still, he emphasized that NATO had significantly strengthened under his tenure, pointing out that defense contributions had risen from 2% to 5% of GDP. This surge, he argued, translated into trillions of dollars and large-scale purchases of American weapons. In contrast, Trump criticized what he described as excessive aid under President Biden, suggesting the U.S. gave without adequate returns. Yet, he acknowledged Ukraine's valor. People thought it would be over quickly because Russia is a big military power, but Ukraine? They're good fighters. A lot of courage, a lot of guts. Diplomacy versus hostility. The conversation turned to Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. Critics often demand that U.S. leaders adopt an uncompromising stance. Trump pushed back. If I say terrible things about Putin, how can I then make a deal with him? I'm not aligned with Putin or anyone else. I'm aligned with the United States, and for the good of the world. He explained that peace requires more than harsh words. You want me to be tough? I could be tougher than anyone, but you're never going to get a deal that way. For Trump, diplomacy, however uncomfortable, remains the only realistic path to ending the war. A broader debate: words or actions? The discussion closed with a pointed contrast between approaches to Russia. Supporters of Trump's view argued that tough rhetoric under President Biden had not prevented Putin from invading Ukraine, nor from devastating parts of the country. They claimed that America's true strength lies not in public posturing, but in pragmatic negotiations that can open a path toward peace and prosperity. Balanced reflections. Here, two competing strategies emerge: rhetorical toughness, designed to project strength, but criticized as ineffective. Pragmatic diplomacy, criticized for being too conciliatory, but defended as the only viable way to secure real results. Trump positions himself firmly in the second camp, stressing alignment with the U.S. and the world, not with individual leaders. His central argument: peace cannot be achieved through hostility alone. A question for readers. The war has become a test of endurance for Ukraine, Russia, and the West alike. Should diplomacy take precedence, even if it means negotiating with adversaries, or is a hardline stance the only way to deter aggression? Clashing perspectives. Diplomacy, gratitude, and the future of Ukraine. From 2014 to 2022, people kept dying on the contact line, and nobody stopped him. With these words, President Volodymyr Zelensky reminded listeners of a painful truth. Russia's aggression did not begin in 2022, but years earlier with the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. Despite ceasefire agreements and repeated negotiations with Vladimir Putin, brokered by leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, promises were broken, prisoners were not exchanged, and the violence never stopped. A debate over diplomacy. Zelensky's frustration was clear. In his view, Moscow used diplomacy as a cover to continue its campaign of violence. We signed agreements, and yet our people were killed, he stressed, questioning the value of negotiations that fail to protect lives. In response, U.S. voices in the room pushed back. They argued that diplomacy remains the only path to ending the destruction of Ukraine. One speaker admonished Zelensky for airing grievances so bluntly in the Oval Office, suggesting it was disrespectful to the American administration that had provided unprecedented support to Kiev. Tensions rise in Washington. The exchange quickly escalated. American officials criticized Ukraine for struggling with manpower shortages, accusing its government of forcing conscripts to the front lines. Zelensky, visibly offended, countered that every country faces problems during wartime. Even you have challenges, though you sit by a nice ocean and feel safe for now, but in the future you too may feel the consequences. That remark triggered a sharp rebuke. Trump's team insisted Zelensky had no right to dictate how Americans should feel, warning him that his country was gambling with millions of lives and even gambling with World War III. The tone shifted from strategic discussion to personal confrontation. The question of gratitude. Another fault line appeared over appreciation. U.S. representatives pointed out that America had provided massive amounts of aid, financial, military, and political. Yet Zelensky, they claimed, had not once said thank you during the meeting. They even accused him of campaigning against Trump in Pennsylvania during the U.S. elections. Zelensky, however, defended his nation's stance. From the very beginning of the war, we have been standing strong, even when we were alone. And we are thankful. His words conveyed both pride in Ukraine's resilience and a subtle acknowledgement of the indispensable role U.S. support now plays. Balanced reflections. This heated exchange revealed deep tensions. Zelensky's stance: diplomacy with Russia has failed before, and Ukraine must rely on its own strength while still calling for sustained international pressure. The U.S. position: without American support, Ukraine would be in an even worse position. Gratitude and cooperation are expected if aid is to continue. At its core, the clash reflects a deeper question. Can Ukraine demand unwavering backing while also questioning the effectiveness of U.S. strategy, or must it tread more carefully to keep allies fully engaged? A question for readers. The Oval Office debate highlighted a fragile balance between survival, diplomacy, and alliance politics. Should Ukraine speak candidly, even at the risk of straining relations, or should it temper its words to maintain unconditional U.S. support? You don't have the cards without us. Sharp exchanges on aid, ceasefires, and trust. If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 3 days. With this blunt statement, Donald Trump reminded President Volodymyr Zelensky of the scale of American support provided to Ukraine. He claimed that $350 billion in aid, particularly advanced weaponry like Javelin missiles, had been decisive in preventing a rapid Russian victory. Obama gave you sheets, Trump quipped, contrasting his administration's contributions with his predecessors. And I gave you javelins. The ceasefire debate. At the heart of the exchange was the question of whether Ukraine should accept a ceasefire. Trump argued that any opportunity to stop the fighting should be seized immediately. If you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it, so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed. Zelensky pushed back, explaining that Ukrainians did not want a temporary pause without guarantees. To him, past ceasefires, such as those negotiated with Russia, France, and Germany, proved that Moscow could not be trusted to honor agreements. We want assurances, he stressed, noting how earlier promises of prisoner exchanges and battlefield restraint had been broken. Trust, respect, and U.S. politics. Trump insisted that Russia behaved differently depending on who occupied the White House. He argued that Putin respected him in a way he had not respected Barack Obama or Joe Biden. As evidence, he pointed to the years of investigations into alleged ties between his campaign and Russia, which he described as a phony witch hunt that had poisoned diplomacy. Despite the controversy, Trump emphasized that during his presidency, no major escalation occurred. He might have broken deals with Obama and Biden, but he didn't break them with me. This assertion, however, was tied to a warning. Ukraine, he said, risked losing American support if it continued to appear ungrateful. You don't have the cards without us, Trump told Zelensky. You're not acting thankful, and that's not a nice thing. Television or diplomacy? As the conversation wound down, Trump suggested the heated discussion might make great television. The remark highlighted the performative nature of the meeting: equal parts negotiation, political theater, and public messaging. Balanced reflections. This exchange highlighted several fault lines. For the U.S., aid has been massive, but leaders expect acknowledgement and flexibility from Ukraine in return. For Ukraine, past betrayals make temporary ceasefires dangerous without binding guarantees. For Russia, perceptions of respect or disrespect from U.S. presidents are woven into the narrative of why Moscow chooses to escalate or not. The underlying tension is clear. America's military support is critical to Ukraine's survival, but that support is not unconditional. A question for readers: should Ukraine accept a ceasefire now, even without strong guarantees to save lives in the short term, or resist temporary deals in the belief that only long-term pressure will bring lasting peace?